Welcome to the lecture. Today we are going to see the topic sources in electric circuits. First, we have to define what is source. A source is a circuit element that supplies energy to the circuit. Here, the sources are classified into two types. They are independent voltage source and dependent source. Here, the independent sources we can define as the value of an independent source is fixed and does not depend on any other circuit variable. Here, the circuit variable we can define as either it may be a voltage or current. So, based on the voltage and current, these independent sources are classified into two types. One is independent voltage source, another one is independent current source. First, we will define what is independent voltage source. The independent voltage source maintains a constant voltage across its terminals regardless of the current through it. So, this is the symbol for independent voltage source. So, here we can see the example how we are going to connect the independent sources to the resistor. So, this independent voltage source are connected in series with the resistor. In the same way, we can define independent current source. So, how we can define the independent current source means it maintains a constant current through it regardless of voltage across it. So, this is the symbol for independent current source. For example, how we are going to connect this independent current source to the resistor. So, this independent current source are connected in parallel with the resistor. So, this independent voltage source, if it having some series resistance that should be connected in series with this voltage source, then this independent voltage source becomes practical voltage source. The same, this independent current source, when it is connected in parallel with the resistor, in that case, this ideal current source will be converted into practical current source. For independent voltage source, the value of series resistance should be small. And for independent current source, the value of shunt resistance should be very high. In similar way, we are going to define the dependent sources. The other name for dependent sources, we can say it as controlled sources. How we can define dependent source? So the dependent source is nothing but the value of the dependent source is depends on some other parameter of voltage or current in any branch in the circuit. So now this dependent source again classified into four types. That is voltage controlled voltage source, voltage controlled current source, current controlled voltage source, current controlled current source. So how we are going to represent this dependent source? So this dependent source will be represented in diamond shape. So if it is voltage controlled voltage source means we have to represent this plus and minus symbol in uh, diamond shape. Similarly, voltage control current source means in center you have to mention with the arrow mark. In outside we have to mention with the IS. Now, so first we will see what is voltage control voltage source. Now, the value of this voltage source is depends on voltage of the some other branch in the circuit. For example, here in this example, this dependent voltage source are connected across the resistor. So the value of this voltage control voltage source is depends on voltage across this particular resistor. So that how we can define this voltage control voltage source is the voltage Vx is proportional to some voltage Vx elsewhere in the circuit. That elsewhere is nothing but the value voltage across this resistor. So this dependent source we can represent Vs equal to mu into Vx. So what is mu? The mu is nothing but voltage gain. Similarly, we can define voltage controlled current source. So in this diamond shape, we are going to indicate this arrow mark that represents a current source. In outside, if we represent one current, that represents current controlled current source. So this example shows how the current source is connected in series with the parallel with the resistor. Now, current source depends on voltage across the resistor in the circuit. So how we can define voltage controlled current source is the current Ix is proportional to the some voltage Vx in the circuit. So the equation for this voltage controlled current source is Ix is equal to G into Vx, where G is transconductance. Its unit is Siemens. Similarly, current controlled voltage source, which means the value of this voltage source is dependent on current through any branch in the circuit. So how we can define this current controlled voltage source is the voltage Vs is proportional to some current Ix in the circuit. So in this example, the voltage source are connected in series with the resistor. The value of this voltage source is depends on current flowing through the resistor Ix. So the equation for this current control voltage source is Vs equal to R into Ix, where R is nothing but trans resistance. Its unit is ohm. Similarly, current controlled current source. So current controlled current source we can represent arrow mark within the diamond symbol. Then outside we can mention with the current. So it defined as the value of current source is depends on current through any branch in the circuit. So the in this example the current source are connected in parallel with the resistor. So how we can write this equation for this current control current sources? Is equal to beta into Ix, where beta equal to current gain. So for voltage gain and the current gain, the unit is dimensionless. So at last, we conclude that the independent source will provide the constant value at any values of time period without depending upon the either voltage or current. The dependent source are also called as control source. Either it may be defined with in terms of voltage or current elsewhere in the circuit. So thank you.